Welcome back. We will continue today with the implementation of our library. However, first I would like to point out a particular aspect of managing our objects. If we now wanted to move our library inside a room, we would have to select all the objects and then use the grab command. Let's do it together. Let's select everything. I remind you that we can hold down the Shift key while we do this. Then we can use the move manipulator or press the G key and then do our move. We can also rotate and scale our object. However, you will notice that it is not so easy to handle the objects in this way. You have to every time go and select them all. We see that Blender gives us several possibilities. Perhaps the most immediate one of all is to be able to merge all these meshes together into a single object. This of course has advantages and disadvantages, but we will see these later. Let's say we want to merge all the shelves, sides, base and top together so that it results in a single object called a library. How can we do this? We already have all the objects selected. If not select them, then call the join command, which is invoked with the keyboard abbreviation Ctrl+J. Before we do that, I will point out that we have an active element, in this case the top, but it can be any other object. I remind you that the active element is the last selected element. It is the one in light orange color. I also remind you that there can only be one active object at a time, and so, for example, if we want to make the base active, we hold down the Shift key and click on it. You see it has turned light orange, and so we see that instead the top has turned back to a dark orange. We also see it from the outliner. Base library is the highlighted element, so it is active. Well, let's call up the join command. The join command will merge all the meshes together and assign to this new object, which is the sum of all our elements, the name of the active object. Well, Ctrl+J. Here we see inside the outliner all the objects except basic library are gone, but inside the 3D viewport these are all still there. Now they are all part of a single mesh. This means that from now on we will be able to select with a simple click our entire library, and we can move, rotate, scale it to our complete liking. In case you didn't make the library by following exactly the steps in the previous lesson, I remind you that you can download the training material for this course via the link found in the description of this video. Well, now let's go to edit mode and see what's inside this new object. Let's press the Tab key, switch to vertex selection mode. We can select all of them with the A key. Let's see here in the bottom right corner the statistics on the scene. So we have 64 vertices, 96 edges, 48 faces and so on, and we can edit our objects. Now if we wanted to move or edit just one element in this library, how do we do it? How do we, for example, select all the faces in this first shelf? One system would be to switch, for example, to face selection mode. I remind you that with the key 1, 2 or 3 we switch to vertex, edge or face selection mode, and then we can start clicking and selecting all the elements we are interested in. This, however, is not convenient at all. More importantly, it does not allow us to select everything because the faces that are in contact with the side of our library are still hidden. So we can, for example, show them by activating transparency. We can do that here by clicking on the X-ray button, and at this point we can also see these hidden faces, and then we can also select them. But even faster, there is a very convenient function that allows us to select on the fly all the elements of a group of faces that are connected to each other, for example, of a shelf. Let's deselect everything with Alt+A and decide, for example, to select this shelf. Let's go over it with the mouse cursor, then press the L key. Blender, with just a keystroke, understands that we want to select not only that face, but all the faces connected to the face we had rested the mouse pointer on. Do some other tests, for example, let's go select the right side of the shelf, press L, and see that it adds to the selection as well. So we see that with the L key, it is very convenient because in a moment it allows us to select an object. So if, for example, we wanted to take a shelf and move it, we can select it, and then we can move it, rotate it, scale it like any other object. But now, if I instead wanted to go back and have all the objects separate again, so that I can select and manage them inside the outliner when I'm in object mode, how can I do that? Well, you should know that the opposite of the join command is separate, and this command is invoked with the P key. The P key calls up this menu that shows us the three options of the separate command. We can separate the objects in this mesh either by selection. For example, right now I have selected a shelf, so by pressing selection, this shelf is put inside the outliner, so it is removed from the active object. Or we can separate our objects by the material that has been applied to them, or we can use the by loose parts function. Let's look at selection first, and then we'll look at this last one, by loose parts, because it's really convenient. Let's first click on selection and see that inside the outliner appeared library base.1. It didn't call it up to me shelf because he doesn't remember that object being called shelf anymore. So what does it do? He assigns the name of this object by adding a little number at the bottom. Now the shelf, we can no longer select it, we still see it. We can select other parts of the mesh, but the shelf object is no longer part of this library. So we come out of edit mode and we see that the two objects are now manageable separately. So we have the shelf and we have the whole library without the shelf. Let's go back into edit mode, select everything and press the P key again to invoke the separate command. This time we go instead to select by loose parts, which means separate all those groups of faces that are connected together. So automatically it's like him going to press L on each element of our mesh. Let's select and see what happens. Lo and behold, a lot of new names have appeared inside the outliner that correspond to as many objects, and they happen to be exactly the starting objects that we had made. We come out of edit mode and go to see that we actually have all of our separate objects again, with the only flaw being that they no longer have a talking name, but they have just this one name that is the same for all of them and with a sequential number. One more thing they have compared to what they had before is that they have all inherited the same origin. That means that this shelf has its origin here at the bottom. This second shelf always has its origin here at the bottom, and so on. All the pieces have their origin at the same point. We have seen in previous lessons how to move the origin, so at any time, if we need to, we know how to do it. Let's look at another system for being able to move our library but without merging it together into a single mesh. One system may be to use kinship constraints. We can tell Blender to associate one of our objects, for example the base of the library, with constraints that connect all the other objects. Let's do this together to understand it better. Let's select all the objects and save the library base for last, for example. Then we press the key combination Ctrl plus P, which calls the set parent to command, which has several options, and the one that is right for us right now is object. It means create a parent bond of all these objects that we selected to the active object, which in this case is the library base. Let's do that and see what happens. Also look at the outliner. Watch out, it almost looks like the join command has been invoked. All but one is gone, but is it really? We are still in object mode. Let's try to select a shelf, for example. Well, we see that this shelf is still selectable. So even though in the outliner it seems to have all merged together, the objects continue to be separate, they continue to be individually movable, and so we can rotate them, scale them, and so on. Well, but then where did they end up in the outliner since they used to be there and now they're not? They ended up inside the base library, kind of like we do with files and folders. In a nutshell, base library became a folder that contains all the other objects. The advantage is that by just clicking on base library, we can do that in the outliner as well as in the 3D viewport. We can move, rotate and scale this object and the others will be affected. So from now on, if I move the base of my library, all the other objects will follow what the base does. So I don't have to be every time to select all the objects, I just have to select the leader. Let's try now to move an object. We see that this one moves freely, however this little hatching, which joins the origin of the shelf to the origin of the base of the library, shows us that there is precisely this kinship constraint. So always remember, the parent object commands over all the children, but all the children can move freely. So now I move the base, and all the objects follow. I only move the shelf undergoes its changes without going to affect all the other objects in the scene. Within the outliner, by right-clicking, we also have the ability to use the command that goes tell Blender to select all objects that are within this object, that is, that are related to the library base. We can override this kinship constraint with the clear parent command, which is called with the abbreviation alt+b, see clear parent, and so if we select the first option, we go back to having the starting situation. Instead, a system for grouping different objects without merging them together and without creating the kinship constraints is to use collections. Collections are actual collections of objects. They can contain meshes, but also light sources or otherwise other types of objects, and we can create them very easily and very quickly. For example, we select all the objects that are part of the library, and to create a new collection, we press the M key, which invokes the Move to Collection command. We have three options. The first is New Collection, meaning we create a new collection. The second is Scene Collection, meaning we move the object within the scene. And then we have Collection, which is the only collection that is present by default, and we also find it within the outliner. Our purpose, however, is to create a new collection, and so let's do it together. Let's press the M key and move. Let's click on New Collection, and at that point we can choose what name to give this collection. For example, Library. Let's click OK, and we see that this new folder has been created, which is a collection that in turn contains all the objects in the library. So, thanks to this system, we can use the right mouse button to select all the objects within the library on the fly, and then we can move them, rotate them, scale them, but without any kinship constraints. You see that in Blender there are many ways to achieve the same or similar results. It will then be with experience that you will figure out for yourself when it is best to merge objects together, create kinship bonds, or group them within collections. Of course, do as many experiments as you can think of. Collections can also be colored. Right-click, and then you can select a color. For example, this one we can color it red, while the default collection we can color it green. All items within the outliner, so including the collections, we can rename them to our liking, even the default collection. This will help us keep our files organized, especially when we have lots of objects, lots of elements in more complex scenes. Well, that's it for this short lesson. I invite you to experiment on merging objects, applying kinship systems, and I invite you to do an experiment as an exercise. Insert an object of type empty. Shift+A, empty. Do you see? There are different types of objects with different shapes. Empty means empty, so empty objects, they are objects that are not rendered. However, you will find that they can have many useful functions. For example, with one of these, I usually use the first plane axis, you see it has this cross shape. What we can do is to use this element as a reference point, as a parent object, to go and relate all the objects, for example, in our library, and then manage them all from this object, because that way when we go and import objects from other files, we immediately see, at a glance, that there is an empty that is related to all the objects, so we wouldn't have to be wondering if we need to move the base or the top or a shelf to command all the others. If we see that there is an empty, we can always use that. So today's exercise is this. Put an empty inside the scene, relate all the objects to this empty, and make sure that this empty can command the whole library. So move it, scale it, and rotate it. I, as always, thank you for following and see you again soon.